So do you guys remember Jordan Peterson, the intellectual powerhouse of the right, the mastermind academic? I recently came across this video called Jordan Peterson Debunks Leftist Gender Ideology in 8 Minutes. And in this video, Jordan Peterson references some data and references some studies that he believes debunks leftist gender ideology. And me, being somebody who just can't get enough of those facts and logic, had to look into the data that he's referencing and make a little response. And that's what I'm going to be doing. The video is kind of long, and most of it is just bloviating and completely irrelevant. So I'm just going to watch we're going to watch a short clip where Jordan Peterson basically lays out his argument and references the data that he thinks is the end-all refutation to leftist gender ideology.
Out there are, all right? They're not massive, although if you sum them across all the traits, you can separate. There are, okay? Are there differences between the sexes? Turns out there are, all right? They're not massive, although if you sum them across all the traits, you can separate men and women with about 75% accuracy. So it's not trivial, but you have to sum across all the traits. Then another question comes up. Well, are those differences sociocultural or biological? Okay, we can test that. We'll go around the world, we'll look at cultures, we'll rank order them in terms of the gender equality of their sociological policies. We can do that with broad agreement from the right and the left. Then the hypothesis would be, if gender differences decrease among more egalitarian societies, then the gender differences are sociocultural, or at least more sociocultural. That's exactly the opposite of what was found repeatedly. That's pseudoscience. It's like, no, that's mainstream psychology. Those papers have thousands of citations.
Okay, so that was basically the argument. Now, to Jordan Peterson's credit, when I was researching this, I found that the studies that he's referencing actually exist, and they do say what he says that they say. And that's honestly more than I can say for most reactionaries who I've fact-checked when they tried to cite data. But the problem lies in Jordan Peterson's interpretation of the data. I don't believe that the conclusions that Jordan Peterson is drawing can be drawn from the data as it currently exists. And I'm going to give a few reasons why. For one, these studies are all, that he's referencing, are all purely cross-sectional, right? And the problem is, you can't actually draw or conclude a causal relationship between two factors based on purely cross-sectional data. You can find correlations using cross-sectional studies, but as we know, correlations don't necessarily infer causation, right? You can find plenty of examples of variables which are correlated with one another, which don't actually have any sort of causal relationship between one another, right? Because, you know, spurious causation is a very common and real phenomenon. And in order to properly establish any sort of a causal relationship, in order to conclude that any sort of causal relationship exists, or conclude anything about the causal relationship between two factors, like the gender equality of a society and the prominence of gender roles within them, you have to take a longitudinal approach to your data. But these studies aren't longitudinal, and without longitudinal studies, you can't actually draw any sort of conclusions about any sort of causal relationship. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that this is what Jordan Peterson is, the way Jordan Peterson's interpreting this data is what's known as an ecological fallacy. An ecological fallacy occurs when you infer conclusions about the traits of individuals based on group level data. So a prime example of an ecological fallacy is Durkheim's studies on suicide and Protestants, right? Durkheimer ran studies finding that certain areas with higher levels of Protestants had higher suicide rates than areas which didn't have as many Protestants. And he concluded from that Protestants have higher suicide rates. What's the issue with the way he interpreted that data? Well, the issue is, what if it wasn't the Protestants committing more suicide? What if it was the other people in the areas where Protestants happened to be overrepresented in that were committing the massive suicide? That were causing the disproportionate rates of suicide in those regions. You can't conclude that Protestants commit suicide more purely based on the fact that Protestants are overrepresented in areas where there are higher suicide rates. And the same thing is going on here, because it could be the case that areas with higher levels of gender equality have more pronounced gender roles in occupational choices and so on between men and women. But that doesn't have anything to say about whether or not women who have been more exposed to gender equality in their lives are more or less likely to fall in line with the sort of gender roles that they're assigned, right? So that's sort of the fallacy that he's pulling here. Another problem with the way that he's interpreting this data, and this is going to be my final point, is that one of the primary factors that's crucial to predicting whether or not there's going to be more pronounced conformity to gender roles between the different sexes. One of the primary factors is the culture and the gender norms. How enforced are the gender norms in society and so on. And the problem is, when you use the measures of gender equality that these studies are measuring, you are not actually measuring gender neutrality, right? So gender equality is generally referred to mean like formal legal gender equality, and that's what these studies are examining. But gender neutrality, which is a sort of the cultural stance on how enforced gender roles are, is not equal to and cannot be inferred by the level of gender equality. The level of gender equality does not infer the level of gender neutrality, and gender neutrality is what's really crucial when examining the extent to which a gender is culturally constructed. Because we know that things like implicit cultural attitudes towards gender norms are heavily correlated with, say, women's propensity to go into STEM. And we also know that very high levels or very low levels of gender neutrality, meaning very culturally enforced gender norms, can exist within societies that have very high levels of formal legal gender equality, right? And another thing that's important to bring up is, if you look at the different domains when we're measuring gender equality, the different domains can be like the economic domain, the political domain, etc. What you find is that countries can vary very highly when it comes to the different domains of gender equality, right? For example, I think it's Taiwan that has like super high like gender equality in like the economic domain, but like super low gender equality in like the political domain, right? And even within domains, like even like within the economic domain, there can be high variation within that domain as far as the level of gender equality in like different sectors and so on. And this high variance within and between the different domains when you're examining gender equality, what that means is that when you're using a metric for gender equality, the data that you get on that metric can't be used to infer the level of equality in domains that aren't included in that metric, which means that the level of like formal legal gender equality, which are measured, which is what's being measured in these studies, cannot be used to infer the gender neutrality of a culture and the extent to which gender roles are enforced in a culture, which is really what's crucial to examine, because there have been, we've seen correlations between like consistent psychological studies have consistently shown correlations between, or associations between, like the gender neutrality of a culture and the propensity of women in those cultures to go into STEM fields and stray from their gender norms, I guess. So yeah, okay, I guess that's all I wanted to say. I think that the way that I don't think Jordan Peterson's being dishonest here, but I think that he was using incredibly erroneous logic in order to draw the conclusions that he drew from the existing data that he's referencing.